What we're going to cover today is eligibility to work. So it's the process of checking that somebody has the right to work in the UK, what document checks you need to do, and how you need to record it and things like that. Right, so I have had to modify this a little bit because the rules have changed quite a bit over the last 12 months. So I've got some slides to explain some of that. So what we're going to cover are why ID checks are important. So a little bit of a motivation slide for why I'm taking up an hour or so of your time. We're then going to talk a little bit about what the government considers a right to work check. What does the government think is necessary in order to prove somebody's right to work? That's also where I've added in a little bit of information about some of the temporary changes or upcoming changes to be aware of. So if you have seen this before, there's going to be quite a bit of new stuff in that part. I'm then going to talk quickly through the new starter process and a bit about how we log it in the system. So what's our practical, looking at it more practically. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some specific visa types. So mainly student visas, because they're going to be what you see 90% of the time. But I will also touch on some other visa types to give you an idea of the other types of restrictions you can come across. Right, so as promised, my motivation slide. Why are right to work checks so important? So eligibility to work checks are crucial to the operation of Unitemps. A temp working without a valid eligibility to work check could result in a £20,000 fine per temp. So the government rules say that if somebody works illegally, then the employer would be fined £20,000. That is the standard fine. It's not like it's not a maximum that they never issue. That's what they would give you for a breach. The home university could lose its student visa sponsor status. So the university's ability to sponsor students from outside of the UK is not an automatic right. It's something that the university has to have a license for with the government. And if we were found not to be following these checks properly, then we would be found to be in breach of that of that responsibility, and we can have that license taken away. So that sounds quite extreme, but that has actually happened to some universities. So in 2012, which I know is a little while ago, but that was the start of the government sort of crackdown on it. The London Met lost its license. That caused a budget shortfall for the university of 20%. So their income for that year dropped 20% in lost student fees and lost funding opportunities and things like that. Now, I don't know the figures for everyone's universities, but to give you an idea of what that would mean for the University of Warwick, where I work, that represents about £150 million a year. So we're talking about an amount of money that's not just a risk to the Unitemps branch, but we're talking about something that's actually a risk to the entire university. All of that's what happens if you accidentally breach the rules. So if you intentionally breach the rules, then it's actually a criminal offence, and you could get a prison sentence of up to 5 years. Now, I don't really think that anyone in the Unitemps network is going to be intentionally placing people illegally or anything like that. But I think it's useful to be aware of that because sometimes in higher education, we can have trouble getting buy-in from academics or managers around the university. And they tend to pay a little bit more attention when you say, you have to do this right. Otherwise, if you're intentionally not doing this right, you could go to prison. And then they tend to view it a little bit more seriously. So because of this, every temp must have their ID checks before completing any work, and that sort of overrides pretty much any other compliance concern. So I've said all my sort of scary stuff. So good news is that me and my team, so we're not here to get you in trouble. We're here to help and support you. So if you have any questions, if you're not sure what to do, or if you're worried that something's already gone wrong, then let us know. If you think something's already gone wrong, it's probably a good idea to phone. Try and sort that out quickly. We obviously can't stop things from having happened if they already have happened, but we can advise you on the best way to manage the situation and not and minimize your risk of any sort of problems coming out of it. Right, so that's my scary motivation slide. So were there any questions before we move on to the actual details of right to work checks?
No.
Great. Okay, so what have we? So the next section, so I want to talk about what the government considers a right to work check. So fundamentally, the government's going to divide the workforce into two categories: people who have an indefinite right to live and work in the UK, and people with only a temporary right to live and work in the UK. And that's going to be List A and List B. So List A is going to be any UK or EEA citizens or anyone with an indefinite leave to remain visa. I am obviously well aware that that point around the EEA citizens is going to become a little bit more complicated quite soon. I've got a separate slide just to talk about that sort of transition in a few slides' time. But for the time being, they're still sort of, they fall under List A. List B is for people who have a temporary leave to live and work in the UK. So that's going to be somebody from outside the EU who's got a temporary visa. So that could be temporary, could be for multiple years, but it just means it's got an end date on it. That's mostly going to be student visas, which we'll talk about a lot later. Right, so I wanted a couple of slides just to give you some examples of what you could see from the different lists. So List A checks must be done once when the temp first starts and remain valid for as long as they remain on the payroll. So if somebody leaves the payroll, then we need to carry out a new right to work check before they can rejoin. But as long as they stay on the payroll, that original check will remain valid. So the types of things you might see, a UK or EEA passport, just make sure you copy the image page of the passport. Some very old British passports have like a second page with details on them. If in doubt, copy that as well, but they're pretty rare. You may also see EEA national identity cards. They are quite varied. So you'll see some that look, they're normally around sort of like credit card size. Some can be a bit bigger. Some will be sort of fancy biometric cards with details on the front and back and everything. Some of them, like this Greek national identity card here, that's basically just a piece of cardboard with their details printed onto it and a passport photo stapled to it. It doesn't really matter what format it is, as long as it's an official national identity card for that country, it is valid as proof of right to work. And you just need to copy the front and the back of the card. And lastly, UK birth certificates, but they have to be shown with proof of national insurance number. So the birth certificate on its own isn't sufficient, but they can prove right to work with that. And then it would be like a letter from a government agency with their name and national insurance number on it, their NI card, or it could be a P45 or a P60 or a pay slip from a previous employer, which has got their name and national insurance number on it. Cool. So List B. So List B Group 1. We'll talk about. There's a special category in Group 2 for people who are in the process of applying for a new visa. But I'll touch on that in a second. So List B checks must be done when the visa expires or if they leave the payroll and return. So very similar to List A, if they leave the payroll, their right to work is invalidated for any future work. But you also need to keep an eye on their visa expiry date. Unlike for most List A checks, List B documents must be current. So for like a UK or EEA passport, you can accept an expired one. The guidance just says to be extra careful to make sure that the image and details are consistent with the person. Right, so what two types of documents you'll normally see. There are a lot of other options on the official government lists, but almost all the time you'll see one of these two options. So you could see a current passport containing a current visa showing right to work. So that visa has to be in the current passport. If the visa is in an expired passport, it is not valid as proof of right to work. That's something that can cause confusion, particularly with indefinite leave visas, because they can actually travel with a visa in an expired passport if they have a separate new current passport. And they may well have been able to persuade previous employers that they're allowed to prove right to work that way. Unfortunately, legally, it isn't proof of right to work. In order to prove right to work, the visa does have to be in the current passport. So that's something to keep an eye out for. If you have that, make sure you copy the details page of the passport and also the visa page, and just make sure you get the right visa as well. I've seen a few cases where people have just copied the first visa they came to, and you suddenly realise when looking through the records that you've got a visa showing a right to travel to America for a few months, which might be interesting but doesn't really help us very much. Cool. And so the type of visa you'll see most of the time is actually probably a biometric residence permit. So these are the new way that the government issues visas. They're about credit card size again, and they've got information on the front and the back, and they're kind of like a passport and visa wrapped up into one. So they're a little bit simpler to deal with because the expiry date of the visa is the expiry date of the biometric card. And as with visa, you will see it will have a section saying what the visa type is, and it will have a section about describing what their work rights are. So just make sure you always read those and understand it. So those are the main types of documents you'll see. For both List A and List B, there are other options. I would recommend checking the government's right to work checklist. There should be a link in the ops manual for it, which is the official list of what documents you can check. The way that the UK government works is that it's not about whether you're convinced that somebody's got a right to work. It's in some ways not even about whether they have a right to work. It's actually just about whether you've seen one of the government listed documents to prove right to work. So I'd always recommend having a copy of the government checklist to hand, because that is the final list. If they give you something that's not on that list, then you need to turn them away and ask them to provide an official document. So for example, things like driving licenses and things like that are not on the government list, so you cannot prove right to work with a driving license, which I think is quite a common mistake that students make. Were there any questions about that before I get into some slightly more specific cases? Cool. Okay. Right. So, yeah, so the first sort of special case I want to talk about was this B Group 2. So in some cases, a temporary worker may be in the process of applying for a new visa. In this case, they need to produce one of a certificate of application, an application registration card. So application registration cards look a bit like biometric residence permits, but along the top, it'll say application registration card. So keep an eye out for that. Or they need to produce a letter confirming their application from the Home Office. That on its own is not proof of right to work. What you'll need to do is you'll need to log a check on the Home Office website with under the Employer Checking Service. So basically this, and you'll need the consent from the candidate to do this because of GDPR. So this is going to be a form, an online form where you fill in some information about who you are, you fill in some information about who the candidate is, and you fill in some information about what you're trying to get them to do. It takes about a week to come back, but you should then get a response saying, yes, this candidate can work, or no, this candidate can't. And that is the other part of your right to work checks. You need to wait for that response and log and keep a record of the response. They're quite good documents these days because they actually give some detail about restrictions and they give you an expiry date on the ECS check as well, which is quite useful. They're typically valid for 6 months, although because of people getting very short extensions at the moment due to travel restrictions, you may come across people who have been extended for like a couple of months, but then the ECS check still says 6 months. If you know that their right to work is supposed to expire before the 6 months, then use the earlier date. Don't trust the ECS check date. Cool.
Hi, George. Hi, George. Can I ask a question quickly?
Yes, of course.
So I've had someone come through recently who they said their lawyer did the application for them, and all they've got is an email with the reference number, and they're saying they haven't got a letter of application from the Home Office. Would that count?
Yes, as long as it's an acknowledgement from the Home Office, is it as well?
Yeah, and so just forwarded the email, which has got saying they've applied.
Yeah, so I think as long as it's got as long as it's official, and it's got the reference number for the application on it, then that should be okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
Cool. So I will say there is a lot more detail in the ops manual about how to do an ECS check if you do come across one. So I'd recommend taking a look there if you haven't done one before. Right, so now another type of check, which used to be quite unusual, but we've now started to have to do them quite a lot because of some of the difficulties of working remotely. Home Office online checks. So the Home Office have introduced a new way for certain visa holders to prove right to work digitally through the Home Office website. This applies to candidates who are issued with the BRP card, so one of those biometric residence permits, or candidates who have got a settled status or pre-settled status visa. So that's going to be EEA nationals who've applied for that. Firstly, the candidate needs to complete an online check consent form. So if you see the ops manual for a template for that, that's also going to get them to mark what type of visa they've got, because as we'll see a little bit further down the process, we're the Home Office aren't actually going to tell us the visa type, so we need to gather that from the candidate. The candidate will then need to get a share code from the Home Office website. So this is the page where they'd need to go to. So they basically log on to through the government website. It gives them a code that they can give to their employer. That's us. So they would give that to the Uniteps consultant, who would then themselves have to log on to the Home Office website using that code. When you log who you are, so you have to log who you are as the employer, enter the legal name for your branch into that, because as it's sort of an official thing, we should be referring to the legal name for the Uniteps branch. If you're not sure, it should be probably the quickest way to find out is actually just on the candidate registration page in the key information documents section. Your key information document template will have your branch's legal name in it. Cool. So, right, so we're going to touch a bit about this topic in I think the next slide, but this check must be done with the consultant in the presence of the visa holder. So we can't just do it all via email. Now, presence means in-person presence, or at the moment it's probably going to mean via video call. So you will need to have a video call with the candidate while you're checking the Home Office record, so that you can make sure the image on the Home Office page matches the image of the candidate on the video call, and that's a government requirement that we do that. A PDF of the check should be downloaded and the ID and visa fields entered as normal. We'll touch about how to enter ID information into ADAPT in a few slides' time. Any extra documents or requirements due to visa type should still be checked. So we'll talk about some extra document checks you have to do for student visas later on in the training. They still apply even if you've done the check this way. So you need to do this check, and then you need to get proof of term dates and things like that we'll talk about later. Does that make sense?
Can I just ask, George, what if they have a visa already, in what scenarios would you want to do this check?
Well, before the pandemic, I was advising no one to use this check at all because when you look at the record online, it will tell you the restrictions, but it won't actually tell you the visa type, which can make it a little bit harder to manage them. However, there's two reasons now why this check is a lot more useful. One is that EEA nationals with the settled status visas, once we are required to check those visas, which I'll touch on in a slide or two's time, they're not going to be issued biometric cards. The only way that they're going to have to prove right to work is through this process.
Sure.
So it's going to be the only route for those EEA nationals. The other thing that's happening at the moment is because we're working remotely and having to do these remote checks, these checks done in this way for remotely are probably still going to be valid after the COVID restrictions, after the COVID temporary measures are lifted. So after the requirements to work from home and the sort of support the government's given for that. Checks of an actual visa documents, which were the temporary rules we've got for remote checks on that, the government is advising that those checks will need to be redone. So If that doesn't entirely make sense, it should make a little bit more sense after the next slide, and I'll link back to this again.
So these are sort of a little bit more valid than checking the visas by email and by video call.
Yes, these wouldn't fall under these would fall under normal rules, not under the temporary rules.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so as I said, there's a lot more information in the ops manual about this type of check. There's an entire page about it because it is a little bit different to some of the other stuff that we do. Right, so as promised, temporary rules for COVID-19. So I kind of skipped over this because it didn't make sense to explain it without this context. In normal times, all eligibility to work checks should be done in the presence of the candidate. So normally, you would have to have the candidate in front of you showing you their passport. And they have to do that themselves. They couldn't send their mom in with their passport, which happens far more often at universities than it should do. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government have relaxed these restrictions to allow remote checks so that people didn't have to be going into the office just to do these new starter ID checks. The candidate should present their documents to the consultant via a live video link. So they need to be on a video link with you and hold up their passport and say, this is my proof of right to work. They will also need to send you a scan of that passport with the following text written onto it. So it needs to say adjusted check undertaken on, and then the date the check was done, due to COVID-19. And it does have to be that exact message. And it should be written on each copy if they had to copy multiple documents. You'll then need to mark those checks as adjusted checks in ADAPT. So when you're recording the ID check, there's a tick box that we've added for adjusted checks so that we can keep track of which ones were done in person and which one were done through this route. Current guidance indicates that these checks must be redone once the temporary rules end. So what the government is saying at the moment, and whether they follow through with it or not is, I don't know. But what they're saying is that everyone we've done with these adjusted checks has to be rechecked once in-person checks are permitted again. And we'll have 8 weeks to do it, which, as you can imagine, is going to be a bit crazy if we have to do that, because quite a lot of right to work checks have now been done through the adjusted check route. So this is the benefit of the Home Office online checks at the moment, because the Home Office online checks, the process I described to you is fundamentally how those checks work. So those checks shouldn't need to be redone, and will save you work if the government does require rechecks of the adjusted checks in the future. Does that make sense? Are there any questions around these sort of temporary rules?
No, that makes sense.
Cool. So the other big complication, because it's not the easiest time to be doing right to work checks, are the upcoming changes due to Brexit. So from the 30th of June 2021, all EEA nationals will be required to prove that they have a visa in order to work in the UK. And that's normally going to be a settled status or pre-settled status visa. And as I said, those can only be checked using the Home Office online check process because they're not issuing actual documents. So we're expecting some fairly substantial changes to the right to work check rules to happen on the 30th of June. As a minimum, I'd say that guidance I gave you about EEA nationals being in List A they will definitely be moving to List B. There might be more substantial changes as well that go around that. The government don't tend to give much advance warning about changes to right to work rules. So it's probably not going to be, I'm probably not going to have more details to give you until a lot closer to the time. But when we do get there, there will be system changes to account for the rule changes, and there will be guidance coming out probably in at least the compliance newsletter. It might get its own separate email to everyone, just explaining new rules. So keep an eye out for that. The good news is that until the 30th of June, EEA nationals can still prove right to work with an EEA passport or a national identity card. The government actually goes so far as to say that we are not allowed to require EEA nationals to show a visa until after the 30th of June. The government basically require that we have to accept EEA passports and national identity cards until that point to make sure that we're treating everyone fairly. Does that make sense? Are there any questions around that?
Yeah, sorry, me again.
Yeah.
What is going to be the status of Irish citizens? Will it be the same as EEA nationals where they need a pre-settled status?
That's an interesting question. It's slightly outside the area that I'm experienced in terms of I normally know about what documents we have to see for proof of right to work. I do remember seeing, I think that Irish nationals wouldn't need settled status, so I'm gonna have to double check that. I imagine
Special relationship or something, but I'm not sure what the implications of that are.
Yeah, so I imagine that they probably, when they issue the new guidance, will have a separate route there for Irish nationals, which may well just be effectively that List A might just become the UK and Ireland. It's a little bit difficult to say for certain though, because I said the government don't tend to give very much guidance on right to work check rule changes before they happen. Last time there was a big change, which was 2014, I think. They basically issued the guidance and said, right, from tomorrow, these are rules. So I'm hoping that we'll get a little bit more notice this time, but
okay, we'll wait and see.
Yeah, but it's a good point, and it'll be something we'll need to keep an eye out for when it comes to when the rule changes are announced. Any other questions? Cool. Right, so my last of these sort of extra in-depth sections about some sort of niche cases, overseas work. So all the previous rules are based on someone working inside the UK. Overseas work falls outside of local rules though. So you're probably looking at somebody working under the rules of the country in which they're working. Unitemps does have a process to manage overseas work, but please be aware that there are a range of significant legal risks for all overseas work. So I'll go through it very quickly. Tax, social security and payroll rules. So if they're working overseas, they're probably not paying the correct tax, and you as the employer is probably not paying the correct tax. So there is a risk of fines both for the candidate and the branch. You may be required to have a business license to operate in that country. There may be local employment laws that we are not familiar with. Unitemp's terms and conditions may be invalidated because they are written for people working in the UK. And there might not even be a concept of an agency worker in the country that that they're actually in. Right to work will be based off the rules for that country. So a British passport doesn't prove that you can work in India, for example. Insurance policies may be invalidated, so you may have risks there. Pensions will almost certainly be invalidated because they're all almost entirely based off working in the UK. And also, depending on what they're doing, there may be some health and safety risks to consider. All of the most dangerous assignments that I've come across have been based overseas. And if you've done very much with the academic departments, then you might be familiar that some of them are probably not as good at doing risk assessments as they should be, considering what they've got people doing. So, yeah, so I just wanted to flag that up. I know that some branches actually ban overseas work entirely, and some branches have restrictions in place. I'd recommend speaking to your branch manager if you do have anyone who's working overseas, though, because they do have a lot of extra risks, and there is a separate process you'd need to follow as a minimum. Cool. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the first section of the training. The next two sections I think should be a little bit quicker. The next bit I wanted to go through was just talking you through the actual right to work, sort of actual new starter process. Right, so so this is the actual process for when for how to get somebody onboarded onto your payroll. I will say, before we sort of get into the process of meeting them, one of the things, the first thing you should do is send them their key information document. So if you're not familiar with that term, the government now require that we send out an official document called a key information document before sending out terms and conditions. That is it's basically a the government mandates a lot of information that's got to be on it, but it's supposed to be information about who you are as the employer, what the role is, what the benefits are, how pay works, and things like that. There is the system can generate templates for that. I would recommend familiarising yourself with the operations manual pages regarding it, about how to input the information onto the client and job level. And then once you've done that, it should be a simple case of just selecting the candidates you need to send it to and clicking the send button, and it will just automatically go out and complete that task. Once that's been done, you will need to bring them in for the eligibility to work check and to get the payroll details. Obviously, that's a sort of virtual bring them in now, I guess. So the ID check itself, you're just going to be making sure it looks valid and matches their details. That's going to be done through a video call if you're doing it remotely. Check the temp is not below school leaving age. It might sound stupid, but we have had quite a few problems with some branches with people who are below school leaving age. So that's the end of the academic year when they turn 16. If you are in Edinburgh, and I think I've got 2 or 3 people in it, from Edinburgh on in the training, school leaving age in Edinburgh is a little bit different. I'm afraid I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's in the ops manual about the how to calculate that. If they are below school leaving age, I probably would advise contacting compliance, because you have to do a request to the local council to get a permit for it, which is a little bit complicated. So you photocopy, so you need to get a copy of the passports and the passport or card that's they're proving right to work with. Now, if you were doing a check in person, which is obviously unlikely at the moment, but could change at some point in the next few months, then instead of using that adjusted check message, you should use the text, the date on which this right to work check was made, and then insert a date. And that's what should be written on every copy that you've checked in person. as I said, that's really, that's probably not applicable right now because we're doing everything remotely, but I do understand some branches are starting to look at coming back on site. So just be aware of that if you do start doing on-site checks. And then you're going to need to upload a copy of these documents into the document library, which I'm going to show you in 2 slides time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, so payroll forms. So we obviously need to get details for how to pay the candidate. So ask the candidate to complete a new starter form. Once they send it back to you, make sure they've completed it correctly, make sure they put their full name. So Christopher, not Chris, it should match up with their passport. Make sure they completed their taxation status and student visa information matches their visa. So these are the sorts of things that people often miss. And make sure the start date is not later than the earliest they will work. If they put a start date in the future, just make sure they're not actually going to start before then, because otherwise your payroll office will refuse payment, which it's a bit of a headache. Check the form is clear and legible, especially bank details. So if they have handwritten anything, just you'd be amazed at how many candidates will scrawl their bank details in and then be upset when the payment goes to the wrong person. Most payroll forms have some information at the bottom that you might need to tick, so confirming what type of ID you've seen, things like that. But that'll be based off your own payroll forms. Cool. So the third part, which is really important to make sure gets done sort of promptly, is updating their record in ADAPT. So we're going to need to record their full name, so their name that's on their passport, to make sure that's right. Record their nationality. We're going to need to record their date of birth. We're going to need to record the type of ID we've seen, and if they're working under a visa, we need to record the type of visa it is. And then certain types of visas can have maximum hour restrictions, and we'll need to record that. So, and then finally, we need to upload the actual documents as they are our legal proof of right to work. So I'm just going to show you where everything goes in ADAPT. I am using a test candidate. So it's a very nerdy test candidate if you watch Battlestar Galactica, because I borrowed one of IT's ones. So not that the IT team are into sci-fi or anything. Right, so firstly, we're in the Contact Me page, and that's where you find the candidate's name. So if the candidate's name is different to their passport, so as I said, Chris instead of Christopher, or they haven't included their middle names or something, then you can correct that just by clicking Edit, changing the details, and then Save. And now we're on the compliance page here, and this is going to be where we record the vast majority of the information. So first, you can see there's a button here for Add Nationality, so you can record what type of nationality it is. And the system's going to try to help you as much as it can. So just below it, you'll see it says visa required. Yes, nationality is American. So it's looking at the nationality and telling you whether it thinks the candidate needs a visa. And it'll be doing a lot of systematic checks based off that as well. So date of birth, you can see there's a button for add date of birth, so you can record their age. That's just below it, you can see it's identifying whether they are an adult, a young worker, or a school age worker. That information is also important for things like pensions and things like that. So to know what bracket they fall into, and also minimum wage. Right, so now we come to actually recording the ID check itself. So you can click ID check, and then that'll bring up a pop-up and you enter the date you did the check, type of document you saw, the document number. Most documents have some sort of reference number on them. The expiry date is normally mandatory. There's one or two documents that don't have expiry dates. So, for example, a birth certificate doesn't come with an expiry date because that would be a little bit depressing. If there is one, put it in. But if there isn't, then if it's for like a birth certificate, then it will let you put it through blank. And then these two, issuing authority and issue date, these aren't mandatory, and only certain types of documents will have something to put in there. If they don't have anything to put in there, don't worry about leaving it blank. You don't have to force information in. Every ID check is designed so it should just be one line per check. So even when you're doing a multi-stage check, like a birth certificate with proof of NI, you should find an option in the identity drop down for birth certificate with proof of NI. So you'll only need to enter one line to record both of them. If you enter multiple lines, then the system gets confused because it doesn't know which one to look at. So, yes, so if they are from outside the EEA, then you might need to record a visa. So this again, just click the visa check and it brings up a pop-up. There's a drop-down list of visa types to choose from, so just choose the appropriate one and enter the visa expiry date. If you've checked a biometric card, then the visa expiry date is going to be the same as the ID expiry date because it's the same document, but that's not a problem. And then again, these three fields, visa issuing authority, visa issue date, and visa issue number. So visa number are non-mandatory, so enter them if there's something obvious to enter, but don't worry about leaving it blank if not. And then certain types of visas might have restrictions on the number of hours someone can work per week. Just add those restrictions in here. We'll talk about student visas in a couple of slides time, and that's important for those. And if you've entered, so if we've entered 20 here, for example, that means that a candidate won't be able to submit a timesheet for more than 20 hours per week. And it will stop them as well from submitting, if they've got multiple jobs, from submitting timesheets that combine to over 20 hours a week. So it's a really good and powerful control to stop somebody breaching their visa. And lastly, if you've done everything correctly, then the eligibility to work check complete message should switch from no to yes. So, and once it switched to yes, it will let you book them in. If it still says no and you can't work out why, the first thing you can do is click the check button, and that forces it to rerun the logic, just in case there's certain ways of updating it where it won't automatically refresh itself. But so we've included a button to force it. If it still says no, then take a look through what you've done and try and see if you can work out if there's a mistake somewhere. If you can't see a mistake, then contact compliance, because to my knowledge, it shouldn't ever display incorrectly. So if it is displaying incorrectly, then well, either there's a mistake that maybe we can help you with, or you found a system bug that we need to fix. So, so either way, if you could contact compliance if you can't work out why it's not saying yes. Cool. Lastly, uploading the actual documents themselves. So this time in the drop downs, you'll see a little paperclip symbol. That's for the document library. So on that page, you can click add documents and it will bring up this pop-up, and you just tell it which folder to put the document in. And it's just a standard document upload pop-up. So we're uploading to Identity. And then when you want to come and review documents that you've uploaded, if you go into the Identity Documents tab, then you can see any documents that you've uploaded listed here, and you can click on them to open them and review them. Any documents you upload will only be visible to your branch or sort of head office. So so someone from IT or compliance, basically, but other branches won't be able to see them. Cool. Were there any questions about that before I get into some specific visa types? Cool. Right, so student visas. So student visas are what you're going to encounter most of the time with visa holders. So student visas are issued to non-EEA students who've come to the UK to study. These used to be called Tier 4 visas, and for the time being, you're likely to still come across a lot of Tier 4 visas because they only started issuing student visas last autumn. As far as the restrictions are concerned, the terms can be used interchangeably. So everything I say here about student visas applies equally to Tier 4 visas. And you'll actually see on the slides, most of the slides still say Tier 4, because I said the logic works exactly the same. Right. So the first thing to be aware of with student visa holders is that there are requirements for additional document checks. So in addition to the normal list B checks, student visa holders must provide a recent student status letter as proof they're studying on a course. Always tell temps about this in advance because they'll probably need to get that off student reception. A copy of the university website to show their term dates for their course. So if their term dates are not included on the student status letter. So some universities will have the term dates on the student status letter, which is great. But if not, then they'll need to show you where on the university website their term dates are. And we also ask candidates to complete a student visa declaration form. So this is just a form that will be customized to your branch that details the restrictions for the different levels of course, and reminding them of their responsibilities and making them sign it to confirm that they have read and understood it. The first two are legal requirements. The last one, the declaration form, isn't a legal requirement, but it's a process requirement at Unitemps because it's basically good practice. And if you are ever when you're next audited by the Home Office, it's really useful to be able to demonstrate that you've communicated this information to the candidates. All of these, copies of all of these should be uploaded to adapt with the ID, so treated in the same sort of way. I'll just show you where that gets uploaded to. So again, we're on the compliance tab here. You can see we've got other checks. There's an other checks table at the bottom, and you can click add check, and that will bring up a pop-up where you can choose, in this case, we've got Tier 4 declaration and record the date. So you'll need to, in order for that status to prove switch to eligible to work, yes, you will need to have recorded the Tier 4 declaration and proof of term dates on this other checks table. Cool. So were there any questions about those extra document checks? Cool. So I guess we'll move on to the actual, sorry, that's the pop-up of the thing. Yes, so the, another thing you might have to record for student visa holders is their term dates. So we've recorded seeing proof of the term dates, but the system is also going to need to actually know what the term dates are, and I'll get onto why in a second. So we actually have a term dates tab And you can add term dates in here by just clicking add new term dates and entering the start and end date of the next term or the one after that. So that the system knows whether they're in term time or not. And I'll explain what that does to their restrictions in a second. Right, so the restrictions on a student visa, they're normally restricted to working 20 hours per week during term time, but are allowed to work full time in vacations. So you can see this is why the system needs to know whether they are inside or outside of term time. So what the system is going to do effectively once you've entered those term dates is that block I talked about, the 20-hour block, it's only going to apply it during term time. In between term dates, it will know to ignore that restriction and allow them to work full time. So, right, so those are the normal rules, but always make sure you review the visa details properly, because in a small number of cases, you'll see student visas with a 10-hour per week restriction. So I reckon at Warwick, that's probably about 2-3% of our tier 4s have a 10-hour per week restriction. So it's frequent enough that it does happen, but rare enough that it is easy to get complacent and miss it. So just keep an eye out for that. You can also see people who have no right to work at all, although theoretically they should never have come in to try to work. It's always important to make sure you double check that on the visa. Term time can vary between courses as well. So everyone, when you talk about university term dates, you often think of the undergraduate term dates, but actually there's a whole set of other courses that don't follow those term periods. So postgraduates are normally the obvious example. For example, PhD students normally don't have set vacation periods, so are always considered to be in term time, so always restricted to 20 hours. And then master's courses can do all sorts of things at different universities. Some do follow the undergraduate term dates, some are always in term time, and some have their own set of term dates that are different. So it's always useful to make sure you understand exactly what level of course somebody's studying at, and that the proof of term dates they're giving you is appropriate for that level of course. And lastly, on completion of their course, they may again work full-time for the remainder of their visa. And again, you would need to get written confirmation from their institute to prove that they have successfully completed. That can be a bit fiddly to get, because the point that someone's completed can be a little bit confusing. The advice we've had at Warwick has been that we shouldn't let anyone work full-time until their degree has been officially conferred. For like an undergraduate, that will be after their exam results have been reviewed by sort of the senior board of the university and signed off. For postgraduates, it's a bit more, for PhD students, it's a bit more confusing because the entire completion of a PhD is quite a drawn-out process. So a PhD, for example, will normally, once they finish doing their research, they will go into a write-up phase where they write up their results into a thesis. This then gets submitted, and they will be sitting around waiting for a while for an examiner to read it. They will then have what's called a viva, which is like an exam interview type thing, where they'll be sitting down for a few hours defending their thesis. The examiners then go away and give the candidate corrections to make. Candidate has to resubmit those corrections to their examiner. They then get signed off, and then that has to get signed off by the university's sort of Senate committee. So that's an incredibly long and drawn out process, and there's lots of points that someone might think they've completed. The advice we've had at Warwick is that they haven't actually completed until that final part of that Senate committee Senate committee signing it off. So I would make sure you do understand as well about completion, that you are check that you're getting it from check that you've confirmed completion from a central university source, not just from their academic tutor, who probably doesn't understand this level of detail either. and that you're sort of adhering to those rules. Right, so before I do that, were there any other questions about student visas? I know they're kind of complicated. They're probably one of the most complicated visa types, and unfortunately, they're what we get most of. Okay. Well, last slide then, so nearly at the end. I wanted to just touch on some other visa categories, because I think with student visas being so common and so complicated, it's very easy to dismiss other visa types, but actually there are other things to be aware of there. I'm not going to tell you about every single visa type, because it would take ages, but I wanted to give you a bit of a range of different types of restrictions, so that you get a bit of a feel for it. There is more guidance in the Ops manual about more visas than I'm going to talk about here. So I'd recommend looking there if you come across anything unusual. Firstly, you might come across a startup visa or a global talent visa. They're actually some of the more straightforward visas to deal with. So people with that type of visa are free to seek unrestricted employment except as a sports person, entertainer, or doctor or dentist in training. Those exceptions, by the way, apply to every visa, including student visas. If you want to be a sports person, entertainer, or doctor or dentist in training, and you need a visa, then you have to get a special type of visa in order to do that. So any sort of standard visa will prohibit you from doing it. But then on the other end of the scale, you've got something like an innovator visa or a tier 1 entrepreneur visa. So those visas say no employment other than for a business that the visa holder has established or taken over. The visa holder has not established or taken over Unitemps, so they cannot work for us. So you very occasionally will see candidates try to work under these types of visas, but they're not allowed to, or at least not allowed to work for us. Tier 2, so this is going to be replaced by skilled worker visa. There's going to be some communication coming out about that in the next few weeks, I think, probably. But tier 2, so these rules will apply to skilled worker visas as well. Any extra work, so these are visas where somebody's been sponsored to come and work for a specific employer, not Unitemps, because we don't have the license to sponsor anyone. But they are allowed to do a little bit of work on the side, but under some quite extensive restrictions. They're even worse actually than tier 4s. So these restrictions, any extra work must be done in the same sector and at the same level as their tier 2 sponsored job. So sector you judge by it used to be called SOC codes, but they've, I don't know what the official name for them is now. That will be in the skilled worker email that's coming out soon. So there's basically official government categories for the work that they're doing. And same level, so roughly the same sort of pay scale. So basically somebody who's been sponsored to come over and do some high-end computer programming can't get a side job waiting tables at a university cafe. They can be for no more than, the work can be for no more than 20 hours per week, and that is blanket across the entire duration of their role. There's no breaks in that. And work must not be during the working hours of their tier 2 sponsored job. So yes, you have to be careful to make sure they're not working when they should be working on their primary job. I should say as well, those maximum hours restrictions, when the government says a 20-hour per week restriction, that's per week. You can't average hours or anything like that. It has to be no more than 20 hours in any individual week. And that applies to student visas as well. So we have a process to manage Tier 2 visas. It's a bit like the Tier 4, but we have a more complicated declaration form, which requires the candidate, part 1 has to be filled in by yourself, then the candidate will have to take part 2 to their visa sponsor to fill in a bit, and then part 3 gets filled in by the candidate. There's a lot more guidance in the ops manual, and I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but I just wanted to give you an idea that there is, if you come across this visa, then there is some complexity that you'll need to look into. You might see Tier 4 doctorate extensions. So these are basically similar to like Startup and Global Talent in terms of the working restrictions. So they're free to seek unrestricted employment except as a sports person, entertainer, or doctor's dentist in training once they've completed their studies. So you just want to see proof that they completed their studies. So basically these are visas that are issued to people who, these used to just be issued to PhD students after they completed in order to stay for a little bit longer to try to set up a company themselves or find a Tier 2 sponsor. With the new visa changes that are happening and the switch to student visas, this is getting opened up to other levels as well. So we'll probably see more of these types of visas, but they'll have a slightly different name in the future. And lastly, dependents. So dependents from most of these types of visas are normally free to seek unrestricted employment except as a sports person, entertainer, or doctor or dentist in training. Always check the visa remarks section though, because that's because the rules can vary depending on exactly what visa their partner is working under, and even details about their particular situation. So just keep an eye out for that. Dependent visas are often, it gets abbreviated down to things like DEP and things like that. Right, that is the end of the training. I am going to see if I can work out how to stop the recording.